I sat in the corner of the community center, picking at my paper plate of mashed potatoes and wondering how I'd ended up here. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh, institutional glow that made even the kindest faces look tired. Around me, conversations flowed in the comfortable rhythm of people who'd found their tribe, but every word reminded me that I was an outsider looking in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman across from me, Sarah, kept shooting glances my way between bites of her green beans. Her weathered hands told stories of hard work in harder times, and her eyes held the particular wariness that comes from learning to read people quickly for survival. She'd been polite when I'd asked to sit down, but I could feel her taking inventory of everything about me, from my too clean sneakers to the way I held my fork like I was still trying to remember proper etiquette. "First time here?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned not to pry too hard into other people's business. I nodded, swallowing a bite of what might have been chicken but could have been anything under the cafeteria-style gravy. "Yeah, first time." The truth was more complicated than that, but I'd learned that truth was a luxury most people here couldn't afford. They needed simple stories, digestible explanations for why someone who looked like me had ended up at the Riverside Community Center's weekly dinner for the homeless and struggling. My story didn't fit into any of the neat categories they were used to. The whole thing had started 3 weeks ago when I'd gotten evicted from my apartment, not because I couldn't pay rent, but because the building had been sold to developers who wanted to tear it down and put up luxury condos. 30 days notice, they'd said, like that was enough time to find affordable housing in a city where rent had tripled in the past 5 years. I've been sleeping in my car since then, rotating between Walmart parking lots and rest stops, trying to figure out my next move. The Riverside Community Center sat on the edge of downtown, a brick building that had seen better decades but still managed to radiate the kind of stubborn hope that comes from people who refuse to give up on their community. I discovered it by accident, really, while looking for a place to use the bathroom and maybe fill up my water bottle. The sign outside had advertised free dinner every Thursday, no questions asked, and something about the way it was worded had made me think maybe I could slip in without too much scrutiny. I've been wrong about the scrutiny part. It wasn't that anyone was actively unwelcoming, but there was a social ecosystem here that I clearly didn't understand. People sat in established groups, shared inside jokes, and had the comfortable familiarity of regulars. I felt like an anthropologist who'd wandered into a culture without learning the language first. The man to my left, Carlos, had been coming here for 6 months, since losing his job at the auto plant. He'd mentioned it casually while reaching for the salt, the kind of information shared between people who understood that everyone here had a story that brought them to this plastic chair in this fluorescent-lit room. His wife worked double shifts at the hospital, he'd explained, but it still wasn't enough to cover their mortgage and put food on the table for their 3 kids. "You stand at one of the shelters?" Carlos asked, his question matter-of-fact rather than nosy. It was the kind of practical inquiry that came from someone who'd learned to navigate the social services system and might be able to offer useful advice. I shook my head. "I'm figuring it out as I go." That was becoming my standard response to questions about my living situation. It was true enough without getting into the specifics of why a woman with a master's degree and 15 years of professional experience was eating donated food in a community center. The reality was that life had a way of humbling you faster than you thought possible, and pride was another luxury I couldn't afford right now. At the table behind me, a group of women was discussing the best places to do laundry when you didn't have a permanent address. Their conversation was full of practical tips delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of people who'd learned to solve problems with creativity and determination. One of them mentioned a gas station on 5th Street, where the owner would let you use the employee bathroom if you bought something small. Another knew about a church that left their water spigot accessible even when the building was locked. I found myself listening more than participating, absorbing information I never thought I'd need. There was a whole infrastructure of survival that existed parallel to the world I'd known, and these people were the experts. They knew which restaurants threw away perfectly good food at predictable times, which libraries had the most comfortable chairs and the most lenient policies about how long you could stay, and which social workers actually cared enough to bend rules when necessary. The volunteer coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who moved through the room with the efficient warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed her work, had noticed my silence. She'd stopped by my table twice now, once to ask if I needed anything, and once to let me know about the resource fair they'd be hosting next week. Both times, her smile had been kind, but professional, the expression of someone who'd learned to be welcoming without being intrusive. I appreciated the approach, but I could also see the questions in her eyes. I didn't fit the profile she was used to. My clothes weren't expensive, but they weren't secondhand either. My hair was clean and recently cut. I spoke with the confidence of someone who'd spent years in professional environments, even though I was trying to tone it down. Everything about me suggested that I was probably temporary, just passing through on my way back to whatever normal life I'd briefly departed from. Only if it were that simple. The woman across from me, Sarah, kept studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You remind me of someone," she said finally, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Can't place it, but there's something familiar about you." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, the familiar anxiety that came with being recognized. It had been 6 months since I'd left my last position, and I'd been careful about staying out of public spaces where I might run into former colleagues or clients. But this city wasn't as big as I'd hoped, and there were always connections you didn't expect. "I have one of those faces," I said with what I hoped was a casual smile. "People tell me that a lot." Sarah nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. Her eyes had the sharpness that came from years of reading people for safety, for survival, for the small kindnesses that could make the difference between a good day and a terrible one. She'd keep puzzling over it, I knew, until something clicked or until something else captured her attention. The meal was winding down now, volunteers beginning to clear tables and stack chairs. People were gathering their belongings, saying their goodbyes, making plans for the next week. There was a rhythm to it that spoke of routine, of community bonds forged in shared experience. I envied them that connection, even as I felt increasingly like an intruder in their space. A young woman at the table next to mine was crying quietly, trying to hide her tears behind a paper napkin that had seen better days. Her name was Michelle, and I had overheard enough of her conversation to understand that she'd been turned away from yet another job interview. Something about her posture, the way she held herself like she was trying to take up as little space as possible, reminded me of myself at 22, when the world had seemed simultaneously full of possibility and completely overwhelming. Without really thinking about it, I found myself moving to the empty chair beside her. "Rough day?" I asked quietly, my voice carrying the tone I'd learned to use in situations that required both professionalism and compassion. Michelle looked up, startled, and nodded miserably. "They said I was overqualified," she whispered. "How can someone be overqualified for stocking shelves? I just need work. Any work." I knew that frustration intimately. The way the job market could feel like a series of impossible standards designed to keep you permanently on the outside, too qualified for entry-level positions, too unemployed for professional ones, too honest to lie about your circumstances, too proud to completely abandon the skills you'd spent years developing. "What kind of work are you looking for?" I asked, settling into the chair and lowering my voice to match hers. "Anything, honestly. I have a degree in social work, but There's nothing in my field that pays enough to live on. I've been applying for retail, food service, cleaning jobs, but everyone wants experience I don't have, or they think I'll leave as soon as something better comes along. She dabbed at her eyes with the napkin, leaving small pieces of it stuck to her mascara. And would you? Leave for something better? The question came out more direct than I intended, but sometimes directness was the kindest approach. Michelle considered this seriously, which I respected. I don't know, she said finally. I want to say no, that I'd be grateful for whatever I could get, but if something opened up in my field, something where I could actually use my degree and help people, I probably would try for it. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human, I said, and I meant it. The people interviewing you know that too. They're just protecting themselves from the cost of training someone who might not stay. She nodded slowly, processing this. Have you been looking for work long? The question caught me off guard, even though I should have expected it. I opened this conversation, after all, positioned myself as someone who understood her situation, which I did, but not in the way she assumed. It's complicated, I said, which was becoming my default response to anything that required real explanation. I'm between things right now. Michelle accepted this non-answer with the grace of someone who understood that everyone here had their own version of complicated. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the volunteers clean up around us with the efficient teamwork of people who'd done this many times before. I feel like such a fraud sometimes, Michelle said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the sound of chairs scraping against linoleum. Like I don't belong here, but I don't belong anywhere else either. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected, because they articulated something I'd been feeling but couldn't name. That sense of existing in liminal space between the life you'd known and the life you were trying to build, between the help you needed and the help you felt worthy of accepting. Maybe belonging isn't about having the right credentials, I said, surprising myself with the words. Maybe it's about being human and needing community, regardless of how you got here. Michelle looked at me with curiosity, as if hearing something in my voice that didn't quite match my situation. You talk like someone who's used to helping people figure things out. Before I could respond, Patricia approached our table with her coordinator's clipboard and her professional smile. Ladies, I hate to interrupt, but we'll be closing up in about 10 minutes. Michelle, don't forget about that job fair next Tuesday at the convention center, and... She turned to me with a slight hesitation. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name earlier. Jordan, I said, offering my hand. Jordan Lewis. Patricia shook it with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of people. Jordan, welcome to Riverside. Are you familiar with our other services? We have caseworkers available, housing assistance, job placement help. I'm still getting oriented, I said carefully, but thank you for the information. There was something in Patricia's expression that suggested she was filing away details about me for later consideration. Maybe it was professional instinct, or maybe she'd noticed the same things Sarah had noticed, the disconnect between my presentation and my presence here. As people began to filter out of the community center, I found myself reluctant to leave, not because I had nowhere to go, although that was true enough, but because there was something comforting about being around people who understood what it felt like to have your life reduced to immediate necessities: food, shelter, safety, connection. These were the basics that everyone here was working to secure, and there was a clarity in that focus that I had found missing from my previous life. I helped Michelle gather her things, noting the careful way she folded her napkin and tucked it into her purse, the way she checked the floor around her chair to make sure she hadn't dropped anything. These were the habits of someone who couldn't afford to lose or waste anything, who'd learned to be methodical about conservation. "Will you be back next week?" she asked as we walked toward the exit together. "Probably," I said, realizing as I said it that I meant it. Not just because I needed the meal, although I did, but because something about this place felt necessary in a way I couldn't quite explain.
Michelle pulled her jacket tighter around herself and hurried toward the bus stop, joining the small cluster of people waiting for the evening route. I watched her go, noting the way she held herself a little straighter than she had inside, the way she checked her phone and arranged her expression into something more neutral for the public world. I understood that transformation, the constant code switching between the vulnerability of needing help and the armor required to navigate a world that often saw need as personal failure. It was exhausting work, maintaining that dual existence, and I wondered how long any of us could sustain it. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars belonging to volunteers who were finishing up inside. I made my way to my own car, a 10-year-old Honda that had been reliable enough to serve as temporary housing, but wasn't exactly built for comfort. The back seat was arranged with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to live in small spaces: a sleeping bag, a pillow, a plastic crate containing my few changes of clothes, and a cooler that served as both food storage and makeshift table. As I settled into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and was startled by what I saw. The woman looking back at me looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. Her eyes held a watchfulness that hadn't been there 6 months ago, and her face had lost some of the softness that came from feeling secure in the world. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't expected to see. A kind of strength that came from discovering you could survive things you'd never imagined having to survive. The knowledge that you could lose everything you thought defined you and still be yourself, just a more essential version. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, already thinking about where I'd spend the night. The Walmart on the south side of town had become my regular spot. They didn't seem to mind overnight parking, as long as you were discreet and moved on early in the morning. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe and free, and those had become my primary criteria for decision-making. As I drove through the city streets, past restaurants where people were enjoying dinner without having to think about where it came from or whether they deserved it, I found myself thinking about Michelle's words about feeling like a fraud, about not belonging anywhere. The truth was, I'd felt like an imposter long before I'd ended up homeless. Even in my previous life, with my professional credentials and my steady paycheck and my apartment lease, I'd carried the sense that I was playing a role rather than living authentically. Maybe that was why the community center felt strangely honest to me, despite how much I clearly didn't fit in. Everyone there was dealing with the basic business of survival, and there wasn't much room for pretense when you were focused on fundamental needs. The conversations were real because they had to be real, because small talk was a luxury when you were figuring out where to sleep or how to stretch $1 until the next opportunity came along. I pulled into the Walmart parking lot and chose a spot under one of the security lights, close enough to the building to feel safe, but far enough away to avoid attracting attention. This had become my routine, this careful calculation of visibility and safety, of being present enough to belong and invisible enough to avoid questions. As I arranged my sleeping bag in the back seat, I thought about Sarah's comment that I reminded her of someone. It was the kind of thing that would nag at her until she figured it out, and I hoped that by the time she did, it wouldn't matter. I hoped that whatever recognition was coming wouldn't disrupt the fragile sense of community I was beginning to build at Riverside. But even as I hoped for anonymity, part of me wondered what it would be like to be fully known, to have my whole story visible instead of carefully edited for public consumption. The thought scared me more than I wanted to admit, because the truth about how I'd ended up here was more complicated than homelessness or job loss or any of the straightforward narratives that people could understand and sympathize with. The truth was that I'd walked away from everything voluntarily, and that made me a different kind of desperate than the people I was eating dinner with. It made my presence at Riverside feel like appropriation rather than necessity, even though the hunger in my stomach and the uncertainty of my future were real enough. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to Michelle's tears and Patricia's careful questions and the way Sarah had looked at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Tomorrow I'd wake up and figure out how to get through another day. But tonight I was just a woman in a car, in a parking lot, wondering if the person I was becoming was someone I could learn to respect. The fluorescent lights from the store cast strange shadows through my windshield, and I pulled my sleeping bag higher around my shoulders, trying to create a cocoon of warmth and privacy in the small space. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rumble of late-night traffic, the city continuing its business while I tried to figure out how to rejoin it on terms I could live with. Sleep came eventually, fitful and interrupted by the sounds of car doors and late-night shoppers, but it came. And with it, dreams of dinner tables and plastic chairs and the complicated mathematics of belonging somewhere you weren't sure you deserved to be. 3 weeks had passed since my first dinner at Riverside, and I'd fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Thursday dinners, Wednesday morning coffee in the community room where Patricia let people use the Wi-Fi, and occasional weekends helping Michelle practice interview skills in the small conference room they let us borrow. The volunteers had stopped looking at me quite with so much curiosity, and some of the regulars had begun including me in their conversations without the careful politeness reserved for newcomers. Sarah still watched me sometimes with that puzzled expression, but she'd stopped commenting on my familiarity. Instead, she'd begun treating me like an unofficial counselor, the way people sometimes do when they sense someone has experience with problems, even if they can't articulate what that experience might be. She'd ask my opinion about dealing with her son's addiction, or whether she should trust the new caseworker who'd been assigned to her housing application. I tried to be helpful without overstepping, but it was hard not to slip into patterns that felt natural. Carlos had started saving me a seat at his table, and Maria had begun joining us for dinner when her hospital shifts allowed. She was a nurse practitioner with steady eyes and kind hands, and she'd quietly mentioned that she sometimes treated people from the shelter at the emergency room. There was never any judgment in her voice when she talked about the overlap between her professional and volunteer lives, just the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that communities are smaller than people think. I was learning to navigate the unspoken rules of this place, the careful etiquette that governed interactions between people who were all carrying some version of desperation. Don't ask too many questions about someone's past unless they volunteer the information. Share resources when you have them, even if it's just knowledge about which social services office has the shortest waiting times. Respect the fact that everyone here is working with limited energy for social performance, and adjust your expectations accordingly. The changes in my own situation had been gradual but real. I'd found part-time work at a call center that paid just enough to rent a small room in a boarding house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, barely larger than a walk-in closet with a shared bathroom down the hall, but it had a door that locked and a window that faced east so I could wake up to natural light. The work was mind-numbing and the pay was terrible, but it was honest and it was mine. I kept coming to Riverside partly because the food stretched my grocery budget, but mostly because I'd grown attached to the people there. Michelle had finally found steady work at a medical supply company, and watching her confidence rebuild week after week had been better than any professional development course I'd ever attended. Carlos had been called back to the auto plant for seasonal work, and Maria had started talking about maybe looking for a house instead of just an apartment. These small victories felt monumental in a way that my previous professional achievements never had. When Michelle brought her first paycheck to show us, the pride in her eyes was something you couldn't fake or manufacture. When Carlos mentioned that his youngest daughter had made honor roll and they might actually be able to afford the class trip this year, the emotion in his voice cut straight through any cynicism I might have been carrying. But it was Patricia who'd been watching me most carefully, with the professional attention of someone who'd learned to read people as part of her job. She'd started asking me to help with small tasks around the center, nothing that required credentials or background checks, just organizational work that suggested she trusted my judgment. I'd helped to reorganize the resource library, updated some of their referral information, and assisted with a workshop on resume writing that had drawn more participants than expected. "You have a gift for this," she'd told me after the workshop while we were cleaning up handouts and stacking chairs. "Have you ever considered social work professionally?" The question had caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so close to truths I wasn't ready to share. "I've thought about it," I'd said carefully, which was both honest and completely inadequate. Patricia had nodded, but I could see her filing away my response along with all the small inconsistencies she'd noticed about me. The way I spoke to people in crisis, the way I organized information, the way I seemed to anticipate needs before they were articulated. She wasn't stupid, and she'd been doing this work long enough to recognize when someone had more experience than they were admitting. I'd been dreading the moment when her curiosity would override her professional discretion, when she'd ask direct questions that I couldn't deflect with vague answers. But I'd underestimated her, and I'd underestimated how that moment would actually arrive.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Michelle pulled her jacket tighter around herself and hurried toward the bus stop, joining the small cluster of people waiting for the evening route. I watched her go, noting the way she held herself a little straighter than she had inside, the way she checked her phone and arranged her expression into something more neutral for the public world. I understood that transformation, the constant code switching between the vulnerability of needing help and the armor required to navigate a world that often saw need as personal failure. It was exhausting work maintaining that dual existence, and I wondered how long any of us could sustain it. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars belonging to volunteers who were finishing up inside. I made my way to my own car, a 10-year-old Honda that had been reliable enough to serve as temporary housing, but wasn't exactly built for comfort. The back seat was arranged with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to live in small spaces: a sleeping bag, a pillow, a plastic crate containing my few changes of clothes, and a cooler that served as both food storage and makeshift table. As I settled into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and was startled by what I saw. The woman looking back at me looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. Her eyes held a watchfulness that hadn't been there 6 months ago, and her face had lost some of the softness that came from feeling secure in the world. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't expected to see. A kind of strength that came from discovering you could survive things you'd never imagined having to survive. The knowledge that you could lose everything you thought defined you and still be yourself, just a more essential version. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, already thinking about where I'd spend the night. The Walmart on the south side of town had become my regular spot. They didn't seem to mind overnight parking as long as you were discreet and moved on early in the morning. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe and free, and those had become my primary criteria for decision-making. As I drove through the city streets, past restaurants where people were enjoying dinner without having to think about where it came from or whether they deserved it, I found myself thinking about Michelle's words about feeling like a fraud, about not belonging anywhere. The truth was, I had felt like an imposter long before I'd ended up homeless. Even in my previous life, with my professional credentials and my steady paycheck and my apartment lease, I'd carried the sense that I was playing a role rather than living authentically. Maybe that was why the community center felt strangely honest to me, despite how much I clearly didn't fit in. Everyone there was dealing with the basic business of survival, and there wasn't much room for pretense when you were focused on fundamental needs. The conversations were real because they had to be real, because small talk was a luxury when you were figuring out where to sleep or how to stretch a dollar until the next opportunity came along. I pulled into the Walmart parking lot and chose a spot under one of the security lights, close enough to the building to feel safe, but far enough away to avoid attracting attention. This had become my routine, this careful calculation of visibility and safety, of being present enough to belong and invisible enough to avoid questions. As I arranged my sleeping bag in the back seat, I thought about Sarah's comment that I reminded her of someone. It was the kind of thing that would nag at her until she figured it out, and I hoped that by the time she did, it wouldn't matter. I hoped that whatever recognition was coming wouldn't disrupt the fragile sense of community I was beginning to build at Riverside. But even as I hoped for anonymity, part of me wondered what it would be like to be fully known, to have my whole story visible instead of carefully edited for public consumption. The thought scared me more than I wanted to admit, because the truth about how I ended up here was more complicated than homelessness or job loss or any of the straightforward narratives that people could understand and sympathize with. The truth was that I'd walked away from everything voluntarily, and that made me a different kind of desperate than the people I was eating dinner with. It made my presence at Riverside feel like appropriation rather than necessity, even though the hunger in my stomach and the uncertainty of my future were real enough. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to Michelle's tears and Patricia's careful questions and the way Sarah had looked at me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Tomorrow I'd wake up and figure out how to get through another day, but tonight I was just a woman in a car in a parking lot, wondering if the person I was becoming was someone I could learn to respect. The fluorescent lights from the store cast strange shadows through my windshield, and I pulled my sleeping bag higher around my shoulders, trying to create a cocoon of warmth and privacy in the small space. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rumble of late-night traffic, the city continuing its business while I tried to figure out how to rejoin it on terms I could live with. Sleep came eventually, fitful and interrupted by the sounds of car doors and late-night shoppers, but it came, and with it, dreams of dinner tables and plastic chairs and the complicated mathematics of belonging somewhere you weren't sure you deserved to be. 3 weeks had passed since my first dinner at Riverside, and I'd fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Thursday dinners, Wednesday morning coffee in the community room where Patricia let people use the Wi-Fi, and occasional weekends helping Michelle practice interview skills in the small conference room they let us borrow. The volunteers had stopped looking at me quite with so much curiosity, and some of the regulars had begun including me in their conversations, without the careful politeness reserved for newcomers. Sarah still watched me sometimes with that puzzled expression, but she'd stopped commenting on my familiarity. Instead, she'd begun treating me like an unofficial counselor, the way people sometimes do when they sense someone has experience with problems, even if they can't articulate what that experience might be. She'd ask my opinion about dealing with her son's addiction or whether she should trust the new caseworker who'd been assigned to her housing application. I tried to be helpful without overstepping, but it was hard not to slip into patterns that felt natural. Carlos had started saving me a seat at his table, and Maria had begun joining us for dinner when her hospital shifts allowed. She was a nurse practitioner with kind eyes and steady hands, and she'd quietly mentioned that she sometimes treated people from the shelter at the emergency room. There was never any judgment in her voice when she talked about the overlap between her professional and volunteer lives, just the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that communities are smaller than people think. I was learning to navigate the unspoken rules of this place, the careful etiquette that governed interactions between people who were all carrying some version of desperation. Don't ask too many questions about someone's past unless they volunteer the information. Share resources when you have them, even if it's just knowledge about which social services office has the shortest waiting times. Respect the fact that everyone here is working with limited energy for social performance, and adjust your expectations accordingly. The changes in my own situation had been gradual but real. I'd found part-time work at a call center that paid just enough to rent a small room in a boarding house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, barely larger than a walk-in closet with a shared bathroom down the hall, but it had a door that locked and a window that faced east so I could wake up to natural light. The work was mind-numbing and the pay was terrible, but it was honest and it was mine. I kept coming to Riverside partly because the food stretched my grocery budget, but mostly because I'd grown attached to the people there. Michelle had finally found steady work at a medical supply company, and watching her confidence rebuild week by week had been better than any professional development course I'd ever attended. Carlos had been called back to the auto plant for seasonal work, and Maria had started talking about maybe looking for a house instead of just an apartment. These small victories felt monumental in a way that my previous professional achievements never had. When Michelle brought her first paycheck to show us, the pride in her eyes was something you couldn't fake or manufacture. When Carlos mentioned that his youngest daughter had made honor roll and they might actually be able to afford the class trip, this year's the emotion in his voice cut straight through any cynicism I might have been carrying. But it was Patricia who had been watching me most carefully, with the professional attention of someone who'd learned to read people as part of her job. She'd started asking me to help with small tasks around the center, nothing that required credentials or background checks, just organizational work that suggested she trusted my judgment. I'd helped her reorganize the resource library, updated some of their referral information, and assisted with a workshop on resume writing that had drawn more participants than expected. "You have a gift for this," she had told me after the workshop, while we were cleaning up handouts and stacking chairs. "Have you ever considered social work professionally?" The question had caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so close to truths I wasn't ready to share. "I've thought about it," I'd said carefully, which was both honest and completely inadequate.
Patricia had nodded, but I could see her filing away my response along with all the other small inconsistencies she'd noticed about me. The way I spoke to people in crisis, the way I organized information, the way I seemed to anticipate needs before they were articulated. She wasn't stupid, and she'd been doing this work long enough to recognize when someone had more experience than they were admitting. I'd been dreading the moment when her curiosity would override her professional discretion, when she'd ask direct questions that I couldn't deflect with vague answers. But I'd underestimated her, and I'd underestimated how that moment would actually arrive.
Because good intentions don't prevent bad outcomes, and because sometimes the people designing programs should be the ones held responsible when those programs fail. Sarah was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, her coffee cup forgotten in her hands. Carlos had moved protectively closer to Maria, but his eyes were focused on me with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile contradictory information. Michelle looked like she was watching a movie where the plot had taken an unexpected turn, her young face cycling through confusion and disappointment and something that might have been betrayal. But it was Patricia's expression that cut the deepest. She was looking at me with the careful assessment of someone who just realized that they'd been lied to, not necessarily maliciously, but significantly. All those careful questions she'd asked, all those small tasks she'd trusted me with, all the ways she'd begun to rely on my judgment, suddenly took on a different context. Martinez was still standing in the center of the room, but some of the fight had gone out of him. He looked younger now, more like the kid he'd been when I'd first met him during intake interviews. "Thompson died," he said quietly. "Rodriguez too. And Williams. Williams had 2 kids, Commander. 2 little girls who don't have a father because you thought you could fix PTSD with better training protocols." The names hit me like individual bullets. I remembered each of them, remembered their files and their personalities and their particular struggles with adapting to civilian life after combat deployment. Thompson, who'd been funny in a way that masked serious anxiety. Rodriguez, who'd been the unofficial unit counselor, the one everyone went to when they needed to talk. Williams, who'd carried pictures of his daughters everywhere and called them every single day. "I know," I said, and my voice cracked despite my efforts to keep it steady. "I know exactly who died, David. I know their names and their stories and their families. I know because I carry them with me every day." "Do you?" Martinez's voice was sharp again, cutting. "Do you really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been playing house with these people, pretending to be just another victim instead of taking responsibility for what you did." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I could feel everyone in the room processing it. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had been hiding, had been taking comfort in a community of people who understood struggle without asking me to account for the struggles I'd caused others. I'd been accepting their sympathy and support while keeping the full truth of my circumstances carefully hidden. "You're right," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "I have been hiding. I came here because I didn't know how else to live with what happened, and I stayed because these people were kind to me without knowing who I really was." Patricia stepped forward then, her coordinator instincts overriding whatever personal feelings she might be having about my deception. "Jordan, you don't have to explain yourself to anyone. And David, I understand you're upset, but this isn't the place for this conversation." But Martinez wasn't finished. "She hasn't told you, has she, about the program she designed, about how she convinced the Pentagon that she could reduce suicide rates in combat veterans by implementing psychological resilience training before deployment?" I closed my eyes, knowing what was coming next. "She took 300 soldiers through her experimental program, told us we were prepared for anything, that we had the tools to handle trauma and stress and crisis situations. But what she didn't account for was that confidence can be just as dangerous as fear when you're in actual combat." Sarah was looking back and forth between us now, trying to follow the conversation. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Martinez turned to her with something that might have been gratitude for the question. "It means her training made us think we were invincible, made us take risks we shouldn't have taken because we believed we could handle the psychological fallout. My unit volunteered for a mission that should have been handled by special forces because we thought Commander Johnson's program had prepared us for anything." The community center was completely silent now, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic. Everyone was listening with the focused attention people give to stories that might help them understand something important about the world. 12 soldiers died on that mission. 12 kids who thought they were ready for hell because a psychology PhD with no combat experience had convinced them they could think their way through trauma. I opened my eyes and looked around the room, seeing my reflection in all those faces. The disappointment in Michelle's expression, the careful neutrality in Carlos's posture, the professional concern in Patricia's carefully controlled features, and Sarah, who was looking at me with something that might have been understanding, though I couldn't imagine what she thought she understood. "That's not the whole story," I said finally, though I wasn't sure why I was defending myself. Maybe because these people deserved to know who they'd been eating dinner with for the past month. Maybe because Martinez deserved to hear me take responsibility. Maybe because I was tired of carrying the truth alone. "The program worked for most people," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "The suicide rates did drop. PTSD diagnoses were reduced. Soldiers were better equipped to handle stress and trauma when they returned from deployment. But you're right about the overconfidence issue. We didn't account for the way that resilience training might make people more likely to volunteer for dangerous assignments." Martinez was watching me with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting years to have this conversation. "So you admit it?
You admit that your program got people killed?" "I admit that good intentions aren't enough," I said. "I admit that psychological intervention can have unintended consequences. I admit that when you're dealing with life and death situations, being wrong means people die." The words hung in the air between us, and I could feel the weight of them settling over the room like dust. Patricia was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, possibly calculating whether I represented some kind of liability to the center. Carlos and Maria were having a quiet conversation in Spanish, their voices too low for me to catch the words. Michelle was staring at the table, her young face working through emotions I could only guess at. But it was Sarah who broke the silence, her voice cutting through the tension with the practical directness I'd come to associate with her. "So what happened after the mission went wrong?" Martinez looked surprised by the question, as if he'd expected the conversation to end with his accusations. "There was an investigation," he said slowly. "Military Review Board. They concluded that the mission failure was due to multiple factors, including inadequate intelligence and equipment failure. But they also noted that the unit's decision to volunteer was influenced by overconfidence in their psychological preparedness." "And the commander?" Sarah asked, looking directly at me. "Was cleared of direct responsibility, but encouraged to resign her commission," I finished. "Which I did. I also dissolved the training program and declined offers to consult on similar projects." Patricia stepped forward then, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "David, I appreciate that you needed to have this conversation, but I think it's time for you to go. Jordan, would you mind staying after? I'd like to talk with you privately." Martinez looked like he wanted to argue, but the fight had gone out of him. He'd said what he'd come to say, had confronted the person he'd been carrying anger toward for months. Now he just looked tired, deflated in the way people do when they've spent all their energy on a single purpose and suddenly don't know what comes next. "This doesn't fix anything,"
he said to me as he headed toward the door. Thompson and Rodriguez and Williams are still dead. I know. And I'm still responsible for the role I played in that. Hiding here doesn't change either of those things. He paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression that was hard to read. For what it's worth, he said quietly, the program did help some people. My buddy Jackson says it saved his life when he got back. Gave him tools to deal with stuff he wouldn't have known how to handle otherwise. Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of people trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The silence stretched out until it became uncomfortable, and I realized that everyone was waiting for me to say something, to explain or defend or apologize. I should probably go too, I said, standing up and gathering my jacket. I'm sorry you all had to witness that. I'm sorry I wasn't honest about who I was. Wait, Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing difficult situations. Don't leave angry. Don't leave assuming you know what everyone is thinking. I looked around the room, seeing the faces of people who'd become important to me over the past month, people who'd shared their stories and their struggles, who'd treated me with kindness when I'd needed it most, people who now knew that I'd been carrying secrets that were bigger and more complicated than anything they'd probably imagined. I wasn't lying about needing this place, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't lying about being lost or struggling or not knowing how to move forward. The circumstances were different than I let you believe, but the need was real. Carlos spoke up then, his voice thoughtful. We all got reasons for being here that we don't talk about. Some of them are about things that happened to us. Some of them are about things we did. Doesn't change the fact that we're all just trying to figure out how to keep going. Maria nodded, reaching over to squeeze her husband's hand. In the hospital, I see people every day who are dealing with consequences of decisions they made or didn't make. Good people who made mistakes, bad people who got unlucky. Most of the time, the difference is not as clear as we want it to be. Michelle was still quiet, but she was looking at me with an expression that was more thoughtful than angry. Is that why you were so good at helping me with interview practice? Because you know what it's like to have your professional life fall apart? The question was more perceptive than I had expected, and it cut straight to something I'd been trying not to think about. Maybe. Or maybe it's because I know what it's like to discover that the person you thought you were isn't who you actually are. Sarah made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. Honey, I think that describes just about everyone who ends up in a place like this. Patricia was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who was trying to decide how to handle a complex situation. Jordan, I'd still like to talk with you privately, not because you're in trouble, but because I think there are things we need to discuss.
I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation she had in mind. The room was beginning to empty out as people finished their meals and gathered their belongings, but the atmosphere felt different now. Heavier, maybe, but also somehow more honest. As I waited for Patricia to finish her coordinator duties, I found myself thinking about Martinez's words about responsibility and hiding. He'd been right that I had been using this community as a refuge from consequences I didn't want to face, but he'd also been wrong about my motivations. I hadn't come here to escape responsibility. I'd come here because I no longer knew how to carry it. The difference was subtle but important, and it was something I'd need to figure out how to explain to Patricia when we finally had our conversation. Patricia's office was smaller than I'd expected, tucked behind the main community room and crammed with the accumulated paperwork of someone who'd been managing social services for years. File cabinets lined 3 walls, and her desk was covered with grant applications, volunteer schedules, and intake forms that represented dozens of individual stories of people trying to rebuild their lives. She gestured for me to sit in the single chair across from her desk while she settled into her own worn office chair with the careful movements of someone whose back had seen too many long days. "Jordan Lewis," she said, leaning back and studying my face with the professional attention I'd been dreading for weeks. Or should I say, Commander Johnson?
"Jordan is fine," I replied, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I haven't been Commander Johnson for 8 months now." Patricia nodded slowly, making notes on a legal pad with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to document everything. 8 months, and you've been coming here for about 4 weeks. What were you doing in between? The question was fair, and I owed her honesty after weeks of careful omissions. Driving around the country, mostly, living in my car, working temporary jobs when I could find them, trying to figure out what you do with yourself when the life you've built collapses and you can't see a way to build a new one. She wrote something else down, her pen scratching against the paper in the quiet office. "And what brought you to our city specifically?" "Random chance, honestly. I was driving through and my car broke down. The mechanic said it would take a week to get parts, so I got a room at that motel on Highway 9 and started looking for temporary work. Found the call center job, found a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, and then found this place when I was looking for somewhere to get a decent meal." Patricia's expression softened slightly at this admission. "Mrs. Patterson's boarding house? I know it well. She sent several people our way over the years. Good woman, doesn't ask too many questions as long as rent gets paid on time." "She's been kind to me," I said, which was true. Mrs. Patterson had the particular grace of someone who'd learned not to pry into other people's business, while still making it clear that help was available if needed. "Now, tell me about the military program," Patricia said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was prepared to listen to a long and complicated story. "What exactly did you design and what went wrong?" I took a deep breath, trying to figure out where to start with something so complex. The official name was Combat Psychological Resilience Initiative. I developed it as part of my dissertation research on crisis intervention and trauma prevention. The basic idea was to provide soldiers with psychological tools and coping strategies before deployment, rather than trying to treat trauma after it had already occurred. Patricia was taking notes again, but her eyes remained focused on my face. "That sounds reasonable in theory." It was reasonable in theory, I agreed. The research supported it. We had data showing that people who underwent resilience training were better equipped to handle stress, more likely to seek help when they needed it, and less likely to develop long-term psychological problems after traumatic experiences. But laboratory conditions aren't the same as combat conditions, and psychological resilience isn't the same as invincibility, even though some people interpreted it that way. I could hear my own voice taking on the clinical tone I'd used in briefings and research presentations, and I made a conscious effort to speak more naturally. The soldiers who went through the program performed well initially. Stress indicators were lower, unit cohesion was higher, and mental health outcomes were measurably better than control groups. Patricia was taking notes again, but her eyes remained focused on my face. "That sounds reasonable in theory." It was reasonable in theory, I agreed. The research supported it. We had data showing that people who underwent resilience training were better equipped to handle stress, more likely to seek help when they needed it, and less likely to develop long-term psychological problems after traumatic experiences. But laboratory conditions aren't the same as combat conditions. And psychological resilience isn't the same as invincibility, even though some people interpreted it that way. The soldiers who went through the program performed well initially. Stress indicators were lower, unit cohesion was higher, and mental health outcomes were measurably better than control groups. Patricia waited for me to continue, her patience the product of years spent listening to people work through complicated stories at their own pace. "The problem emerged about 6 months into deployment. Some units began volunteering for missions that were considered high risk beyond their normal assignment parameters. When questioned, soldiers consistently reported that they felt confident in their ability to handle whatever psychological stress those missions might generate." I paused, remembering the reports that had started trickling back from field commanders, concerned notes about overconfidence, about soldiers who seemed to believe their training had made them immune to the psychological effects of combat. The mission that Martinez was referring to was supposed to be handled by a special operations unit with specific training for urban warfare in hostile territory. His unit volunteered for it instead, citing their psychological preparedness as justification for why they should be considered. Patricia's pen had stopped moving, and they were approved for the mission. They were. Command figured that if the soldiers believed they were ready, and if their psychological assessments supported that confidence, there was no reason to not let them take on additional responsibility. I rubbed my temples, feeling the familiar headache that came with thinking too hard about decisions that couldn't be undone. It was exactly the kind of initiative and confidence that the military values in its personnel. But it went wrong. It went catastrophically wrong. The unit encountered resistance they weren't trained for in terrain they weren't familiar with, using equipment they hadn't adequately practiced with.
Under normal circumstances, that might have been manageable. But because they'd volunteered for a mission beyond their capabilities, they were isolated from backup and support systems. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. How many casualties? 12 dead, 8 wounded seriously enough to be medically discharged, out of a unit of 32 soldiers. The numbers came out automatically, burned into my memory by months of review boards and investigations. Martinez was one of the wounded, took shrapnel in his left leg and spent 4 months in military hospitals. And that's when you realized the program was flawed? That's when I realized I was flawed, I corrected. The program worked exactly as designed. It gave soldiers psychological tools to handle stress and trauma. It increased their confidence in their ability to cope with difficult situations. It reduced anxiety and improved performance metrics across multiple measures. Patricia looked confused. Then how was it your fault? Because I designed a program that made people feel invincible without making them actually invincible. I gave them confidence without wisdom, resilience without humility. I created soldiers who believed they could handle anything psychologically, but who still had the same physical and tactical limitations as everyone else. The words hung in the air between us, and I could see Patricia working through the implications. She'd spent enough time in social services to understand how good intentions could have terrible consequences, how programs designed to help people could sometimes hurt them in unexpected ways. What did the investigation conclude? That the mission failure was due to multiple factors, including inadequate intelligence, equipment failure, and tactical errors by field commanders. They found that the unit's decision to volunteer was influenced by overconfidence in their psychological preparedness, but they stopped short of calling that a direct causal factor in the casualties. But you blamed yourself anyway. I blamed myself because I was responsible, I said firmly. Not for the tactical failures or the equipment problems or the intelligence gaps, but for creating a mindset that contributed to putting those soldiers in danger in the first place. Patricia set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the expression of someone who was trying to understand a complex problem. What did you do after the investigation? I resigned my commission, dissolved the training program, and declined all offers to consult on similar projects. I also recommended that the Pentagon conduct a full review of all psychological intervention programs to assess for similar overconfidence issues. And then I had no idea what to do with myself. I'd spent 6 years developing expertise in something I no longer believed in, working toward goals that had turned out to be more complicated than I understood. I didn't trust my own judgment anymore, and I couldn't figure out how to rebuild a career around skills that had proven to be dangerous. Patricia was quiet for several minutes, making occasional notes while I sat there feeling exposed in a way I hadn't experienced since the first round of investigation interviews. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression that was thoughtful rather than judgmental. Jordan, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In the time you've been coming here, have you seen evidence that the skills you developed in the military might be useful in civilian contexts? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean the way you talk to people in crisis, the way you organize information and assess situations,
The way you seem to instinctively understand what someone needs to hear when they're overwhelmed. Patricia consulted her notes. Michelle told me last week that you'd helped her practice interview techniques, said you had insights about confidence and self-presentation that were more useful than anything she'd learned in job placement workshops. I thought about my interactions with Michelle, remembering the way she'd gradually straightened her shoulders and started making eye contact during our practice sessions. I just tried to help her see herself the way a potential employer might. Exactly. You assessed her strengths and helped her develop strategies to present them effectively. That's exactly the kind of psychological intervention work you were doing in the military, just applied to a different kind of stress situation. The comparison made me uncomfortable, because it was accurate. It's different when the stakes are lower. Is it? Michelle has been unemployed for 8 months. She was 3 weeks away from losing her housing when she finally got that job. For her, the stakes felt pretty high. Patricia pulled a folder from one of her desk drawers and spread several papers across her desk. I've been watching you work with people here for weeks, and I've been documenting what I've seen. You have a gift for crisis intervention, Jordan. You're intuitive about what people need, you're calm under pressure, and you have the professional training to back up your instincts. I looked at the papers she'd laid out, recognizing intake forms and progress notes. You've been evaluating me? I've been observing you, yes, because I've been trying to figure out how to approach a conversation I've been wanting to have for 2 weeks now. Patricia leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. Jordan, we need someone with your skills here, not as a volunteer, but as a professional staff member. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Patricia, I can't. You heard what Martinez said.
I designed a program that got people killed. You designed a program that saved hundreds of lives and had unintended consequences that contributed to 12 deaths, she corrected firmly. Those are not the same thing, and the fact that you can't see the difference is exactly why you've been hiding out instead of using your skills to help people. I started to protest, but she held up a hand to stop me. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Patricia continued. I see someone who took responsibility for outcomes beyond her control because she has the integrity to hold herself accountable for the consequences of her work. I see someone who walked away from a successful career because she prioritized ethical concerns over professional advancement. And I see someone who's been helping people in crisis for the past month while believing she has no right to do so. The words cut deeper than I'd expected, because they echoed thoughts I'd been having but hadn't been willing to acknowledge. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Jordan, you've been beating yourself up for 8 months because your program had an unintended consequence that contributed to a tragedy. But you've also been ignoring the fact that crisis intervention is exactly what you've been doing here, and you've been doing it well. Patricia picked up one of the forms from her desk. This is Michelle's intake assessment from 3 months ago. Depression, anxiety, history of family trauma, no stable employment history, and what we classified as high risk for long-term homelessness. You want to know what her most recent assessment looks like? She pulled out another form and placed it next to the first one. Stable employment, improved mental health indicators, developing coping strategies for stress management, and what we're now classifying as low risk for future housing instability. You want to tell me that your intervention skills had nothing to do with that transformation? I looked at the 2 forms, seeing the stark difference in Michelle's circumstances, reflected in clinical language and checkboxes. I just listened to her and helped her practice interviews. You assessed her psychological state, identified her specific needs, developed targeted interventions to address her confidence issues, and provided ongoing support while she implemented new coping strategies, Patricia said, her voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a professional development manual. That's textbook crisis intervention work, Jordan. The comparison made me squirm because it was so accurate. The context is completely different. The context is always different. Combat stress, unemployment stress, housing insecurity, relationship trauma,
These are all different kinds of crisis situations, but the underlying psychological processes are often similar. Patricia gathered the forms and put them back in the folder. The question isn't whether your skills are transferable. The question is whether you're going to keep punishing yourself for one tragic outcome while ignoring all the positive outcomes you're capable of creating. I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what she was suggesting. The idea of returning to professional practice felt simultaneously appealing and terrifying, like being offered the chance to drive again after causing a fatal accident. "What kind of position are you talking about?" I asked finally. "Crisis intervention specialist. We've been trying to fill the position for 6 months, but we can't find anyone with the right combination of clinical training and practical experience. Most of the applicants either have academic credentials but no real-world crisis experience, or they have experience but no formal training in psychological intervention techniques." Patricia pulled another folder from her desk drawer. The position would involve intake assessments for people in crisis situations, development of individual intervention plans, coordination with other social services agencies, and direct counseling for people dealing with trauma, addiction, mental health issues, and life transitions. "I don't have a license to practice therapy." "You don't need one for this position. You'd be working under the supervision of our consulting psychiatrist, and the focus is on crisis intervention and case management rather than long-term therapy." Patricia opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a job description. The salary isn't huge, but it comes with full benefits and housing assistance. There's also funding for continuing education if you wanted to pursue additional certifications. I read through the job description, recognizing duties and responsibilities that aligned almost perfectly with the work I'd been doing in the military. The difference was that instead of preparing soldiers for combat stress, I'd be helping civilians navigate life crises. "Why are you offering this to me?" I asked. "You've known who I really was for less than an hour." "Because I've been watching you work for weeks, and I've seen what you can do when you trust your instincts and use your training to help people. Also because I think you need this job as much as we need you to take it." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've been trying to hide from who you are instead of figuring out how to be who you are in a different context. You can't escape the fact that you're someone with advanced training in crisis intervention and psychological assessment. You can try to pretend those skills don't exist, but they're going to keep showing up whether you want them to or not." Patricia gestured toward the main community room. "You've been doing crisis intervention work here for a month. The only difference is that you've been doing it informally and unpaid while telling yourself it doesn't count because you're not in a professional role." I thought about my interactions with Michelle, with Sarah, with Carlos and Maria, and the dozen other people I'd talked with over the past weeks. Patricia was right that I'd been using professional skills, but it had felt different because it was voluntary and unstructured. What if I make the same mistakes? What if I give someone advice that ends up hurting them? What if you don't give someone advice and they hurt themselves because they didn't have access to the help they needed? Patricia countered. "Jordan, there are no guarantees in this work. There never have been. The only guarantee is that people in crisis need help, and you have skills that could provide that help." She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "Look, I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it."
Talk to some of the people you've been working with here. Ask them if they think your intervention skills are valuable. Ask them if they think you should be using those skills professionally. The suggestion made me nervous because I suspected I knew what those conversations would reveal. What about the people who already know my background? Martinez made it pretty clear that he thinks I'm responsible for deaths. Other people might feel the same way. Other people might, Patricia agreed, but most people are capable of understanding that complex situations have multiple contributing factors, and that good people can make mistakes without becoming bad people. The question is whether you're capable of understanding that about yourself.
I looked around her office, taking in the evidence of years spent helping people navigate impossible situations, grant applications for programs that might or might not get funded, case files for people whose problems didn't have clear solutions, volunteer schedules that depended on the goodwill of community members who had their own struggles to manage. "Can I think about it for a few days?" "Take all the time you need," Patricia said, gathering the papers from her desk. "But Jordan, don't make this decision based on fear. Make it based on what you know about your abilities and what you believe about your responsibility to use those abilities to help people." I left Patricia's office feeling more confused than I had in months. The possibility of returning to professional practice was both appealing and terrifying, offering the chance to use skills I'd developed over years of training, while risking the discovery that I really was as dangerous as I sometimes believed myself to be. The main community room was nearly empty now, just a few volunteers finishing the cleanup, and Sarah sitting by herself with a fresh cup of coffee. She looked up when I walked past her table, gesturing for me to join her with the casual authority of someone who'd decided we needed to talk. "Hell of an evening," she said, as I sat down across from her. "That's one way to put it." Sarah studied my face with the attention of someone who'd spent years learning to read people quickly and accurately. "You want to tell me what that was really about? The whole story? Not just the parts that make you look bad?" The question surprised me with its directness. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I've been sitting here thinking about everything that young man said and everything you said back to him, and I'm trying to figure out if I should be angry at you for lying to us or grateful to you for the help you've given people." Sarah's honesty was disarming, cutting through the careful social protocols that usually govern conversations about difficult topics. "I don't know if those are mutually exclusive." "Maybe they're not," she agreed, "but I'd like to understand what really happened before I decide how I feel about it." So I told her, not the clinical version I'd given Patricia, but the human version, with all the doubt and guilt and complicated emotions that had driven me to resign my commission and spend 8 months driving around the country trying to figure out how to live with myself. I told her about the soldiers who died and the ones who lived, about the review board and the investigation, and the slow realization that good intentions weren't sufficient protection against tragic outcomes. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me talk through the whole complicated story. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing what I'd told her. "So let me see if I understand this," she said, finally. "You developed a program that helped hundreds of soldiers cope with combat stress, but it also made some soldiers overconfident about their abilities. A group of those soldiers volunteered for a dangerous mission they weren't qualified for, and 12 of them died. You blamed yourself for their overconfidence, resigned from the military, and have been punishing yourself ever since." That's a simplified version, but essentially accurate. "And in the meantime, you've been helping people here deal with crisis situations, using the same skills you developed in the military." "I guess so." Sarah shook her head with what might have been exasperation. "Honey, do you have any idea how many people in this room tonight have made decisions that got other people hurt? How many of us are carrying guilt about things we did or didn't do that had consequences we never intended?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Carlos still blames himself for the accident that put his father in a wheelchair, even though the other driver was drunk and ran a red light. Maria carries guilt about patients she couldn't save, even though she's saved hundreds of others. Michelle thinks she's responsible for her brother's overdose because she introduced him to the friends he was using with." Sarah's look took on the intensity of someone who'd thought hard about these issues. "The difference between you and most people isn't that you made a mistake that had terrible consequences. The difference is that you have skills that could prevent other people from making similar mistakes, and you're too busy feeling guilty to use them. It's not that simple, isn't it? You think those soldiers would want you to stop helping people because their deaths made you feel guilty? You think the families of the people who died would prefer that you waste your training rather than use it to save other lives? The questions hit harder than I had expected because they forced me to consider perspectives I'd been avoiding. I don't know if they'd want. Then maybe you should find out, Sarah said simply. Maybe, instead of assuming that everyone sees you as a dangerous failure, you should talk to some of the people whose lives were affected by your program. She pulled a piece of paper from her purse and wrote something on it before sliding it across the table to me. That's my son's phone number. He was in the Army, went through some kind of psychological training program before his deployment to Iraq, came home with fewer problems than a lot of his friends. I've always wondered what made the difference for him. I looked at the phone number, recognizing the area code from the base where I'd conducted most of my research. Sarah, I can't just call your son and ask him about his military experience. Why not?
He's proud of his service, and he likes talking about the training that helped him readjust to civilian life. Plus, he's been looking for work in the mental health field since he got his bachelor's degree last year. Might be good for both of you to talk. The suggestion was both practical and terrifying, offering the possibility of getting feedback about my program from someone who'd actually been through it. What if he tells me the same thing Martinez did? What if he says the training made him overconfident or reckless? Then you'll learn something important about your work, and you'll be able to use that information to help people better in the future, Sarah said matter-of-factly. But what if he tells you something different? What if he tells you the training saved his life or helped him help other people? I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, not committing to anything, but not rejecting the possibility either. Why are you doing this? Why do you care whether I figure out how to live with my past? Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her all evening. Because I've been watching you for weeks, and I've seen the way you listen to people. Really listen, like what they're saying matters. You helped Michelle find her confidence, you gave Carlos someone to talk to about his guilt over his father's accident, and you've been treating all of us like we're worth paying attention to. She paused, gathering our thoughts. People with your kind of training, they usually don't end up in places like this unless something went very wrong in their lives. But instead of being bitter or angry or feeling sorry for yourself, you've been using whatever happened to you to understand other people better. That's not something you learn in school, honey. That's something you earn through suffering and choose to do something useful with. The observation was more perceptive than I'd expected, and it highlighted something I'd been too close to see clearly. I haven't felt like I was choosing anything. I've felt like I was just trying to survive. Maybe that's what choosing looks like sometimes. Maybe the choice isn't always between good options and bad options. Maybe sometimes it's between surviving in a way that helps other people and surviving in a way that doesn't. I thought about this as I helped her clear our table and gather her things. The idea that my presence at Riverside had been a choice rather than just an accident of circumstances was something I hadn't considered, but it reframed my experience in a way that felt less like hiding and more like healing. As we walked toward the exit together, Sarah turned to me with one final observation. Patricia's going to offer you a job, if she hasn't already. You should take it. How do you know that? Because I've seen the way she's been watching you work with people, and I know she's been trying to fill that crisis intervention position for months. Plus, she asked me what I thought about your qualifications last week. I stopped walking. She asked you what? She wanted to know if I thought you had the temperament for crisis work, if I'd seen you handle difficult situations well, if I thought people here trusted your judgment. Sarah grinned at my expression. I told her you were wasted driving buses and answering phones, and that if she had a position that could use your skills, she'd be crazy not to offer it to you. You recommended me for a job before you knew anything about my background.
I recommended you because I could see who you are in how you treat people, Sarah said firmly. Your background just confirms that you have the training to back up your instincts. That night, I sat in my small room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and thought about everything that had happened. Martinez's accusations, Patricia's job offer, Sarah's unexpected support, and the growing realization that I'd been thinking about my situation in ways that weren't entirely accurate. For 8 months, I'd been telling myself that I was hiding because I was dangerous, because my professional judgment couldn't be trusted, because I needed to protect other people from the consequences of my mistakes. But sitting there in the quiet darkness, I began to understand that I'd actually been hiding because I was afraid. Afraid of taking responsibility for outcomes I couldn't control. Afraid of risking failure again. Afraid of discovering that my skills really were more valuable than my guilt. The next morning, I called Sarah's son. His name was David, and he was surprised but pleased to hear from someone who'd been involved in the military training program he'd completed 5 years earlier. We talked for over an hour about his experiences, his transition back to civilian life, and the ways the psychological resilience training had influenced his approach to handling stress and crisis situations. The thing is, he told me, I probably would have volunteered for dangerous missions anyway, because that's what you do when you're young and think you're invincible. But the training gave me tools to handle the psychological aftermath when things went wrong. It helped me process trauma instead of just carrying it around until it destroyed me. He paused, and I could hear him thinking about how to articulate something complex. Look, I know there were some units that got in trouble because they were overconfident, but there were a lot more units that came home intact because they knew how to support each other and ask for help when they needed it. You can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to save anyone. The conversation left me with more questions than answers, but they were different questions than the ones I'd been asking myself for months. Instead of wondering whether I was responsible for deaths, I began wondering whether I was responsible for the lives I might save by using my skills professionally again. 2 days later, I knocked on Patricia's office door and told her I was ready to discuss the crisis intervention position. We spent 3 hours going over job responsibilities, supervision structure, and the practical details of transitioning from volunteer to staff member. By the end of the conversation, I had a start date and a new understanding of what it might mean to build a career around helping people navigate impossible situations. Michelle was the first person I told about the job offer, and her reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Finally," she said, grinning so widely that it made her whole face light up. "I was wondering how long it was going to take everyone to figure out that you were way overqualified for handing out dinner plates." Carlos and Maria were equally supportive, with Maria mentioning that the emergency area canal could use someone with crisis intervention training for their overflow mental health cases. Even Sarah seemed satisfied, as if she'd been waiting for me to reach a conclusion she'd already arrived at weeks earlier. The hardest conversation was with Martinez. I called him using the contact information Patricia had gotten from security, and we met for coffee at a diner near the Veterans Hospital where he was receiving ongoing treatment for his injuries. He listened while I told him about the job offer and my decision to return to professional practice, and his response was more thoughtful than I'd expected. "I'm still angry," he said.
"I'm angry about Thompson and Rodriguez and Williams, and I'm angry that the program gave us confidence we couldn't back up. But I'm also angry that you disappeared after the investigation instead of trying to fix what went wrong." He stirred his coffee methodically, considering his words carefully. "Maybe if you'd stayed and worked on improving the training protocols, figured out how to give people resilience without overconfidence, those problems could have been addressed. Maybe other soldiers could have benefited from a better version of the program." The suggestion that my resignation had been a failure of responsibility was painful, because it contained enough truth to be devastating. I thought stepping away was the ethical choice. "Maybe it was," Martinez said, "but maybe this is the ethical choice too. Maybe taking responsibility means figuring out how to do better next time, not just walking away when things go wrong." 3 months later, I was settling into my new office at the Riverside Community Center, surrounded by case files and resource directories and the accumulated paperwork of someone who'd returned to professional practice with a much clearer understanding of its limitations and possibilities. The work was challenging in ways I'd forgotten, and rewarding in ways I hadn't expected, combining clinical skills with the practical wisdom I'd gained from months of living in survival mode myself. My first major case was a veteran dealing with adjustment disorders and housing instability, someone whose story had enough parallels to my own that I had to be careful not to project my experience onto his situation. But the work felt right in a way that my previous position never had, grounded in humility rather than confidence, focused on supporting people through crisis rather than preventing crisis from affecting them. Sarah still came to Thursday dinners, though she'd found stable housing through a program Patricia had connected her with. Michelle had been promoted to supervisor at the medical supply company and was taking night classes in business management. Carlos and Maria had found a small house they could afford, and their youngest daughter had indeed made that honor roll trip she'd been hoping for. The community at Riverside continued to evolve, with new people arriving each week carrying their own versions of desperation and hope. I found myself drawing on both my professional training and my personal experience of loss and rebuilding, understanding crisis intervention in ways that academic preparation alone could never have taught me. Martinez still struggled with anger and grief, but he'd also enrolled in a counseling program at the community college, interested in working with other veterans dealing with trauma and adjustment issues. We talked occasionally, not as friends but as professionals who understood that healing complex problems required long-term commitment rather than quick solutions. Patricia had been right that I needed the job as much as the center needed me to take it, not because it validated my skills or restored my professional identity, but because it gave me a way to integrate everything I'd learned about survival and resilience, and the complicated business of helping people navigate impossible situations. Late at night, when I was finishing case notes in my small apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage, I sometimes thought about the soldiers who died and the ones who'd lived, about the families affected by both outcomes, and about the weight of responsibility that comes with having skills that can influence other people's lives. The guilt hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more useful. A constant reminder that good intentions require wisdom, that confidence needs to be balanced with humility, and that helping people is work that demands everything you have to give while accepting that it will never be enough. But it was still work worth doing, and I was finally ready to do it again. 6 months into my new position, I received an unexpected email that would change everything. The subject line read, "Thank you for saving my life, Commander Johnson." It was from Sergeant Jessica Chin, a soldier who'd gone through my resilience training program 3 years earlier. She'd survived 2 deployments, used the psychological tools I'd taught her to help fellow soldiers through their darkest moments, and was now pursuing a master's degree in clinical psychology. She wrote, "I know what happened with Martinez's unit. I know you blamed yourself and left the service, but I wanted you to know that your program gave me the strength to survive things I never could have handled alone. More importantly, it taught me how to recognize when others were struggling and how to help them find professional support before crisis became tragedy." The email included photographs from a ceremony where Jessica had received a commendation for preventing 3 soldier suicides through early intervention and peer counseling. She'd used techniques directly from my training curriculum, adapted for the unique stresses her unit faced during extended combat operations. 12 families lost someone they loved, and that's a tragedy that can't be undone, her message continued. But hundreds of families still have their sons and daughters because of the skills you taught us. I hope someday you'll see that both things can be true at the same time. That evening, I shared Jessica's email with Patricia during our weekly supervision meeting. She read it carefully, and then looked up at me with the slight smile she got when she was about to make a point she'd been waiting weeks to articulate. "Jordan, do you remember what you told me during your interview about wanting to help people but being afraid of causing harm?" I nodded, remembering the conversation that had convinced me to take the position. What Jessica is describing is exactly what effective crisis intervention looks like. You can't save everyone, but you can give people tools that help them save themselves and others. That's what you did in the military, and it's what you're doing here. She was right, and I finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell me months earlier about choosing how to survive. I could carry the weight of those 12 deaths as evidence that I was dangerous, or I could carry them as reminders that every intervention mattered, because every life saved prevented another family from experiencing that kind of loss. The work at Riverside continued to challenge and fulfill me in ways I'd never anticipated. each person who walked through our doors brought their own version of crisis, and each successful intervention felt like a small victory against the chaos that had consumed so much of my own life. I wasn't the same confident professional who designed the original resilience program, but I was something better. Someone who understood both the power and the limitations of psychological intervention. Someone who could help others navigate crisis while remaining humble about my ability to control outcomes. Martinez and I eventually developed a professional relationship built on mutual respect rather than forgiveness. He completed his counseling program and joined our staff as a peer support specialist, bringing lived experience with combat trauma that complemented my clinical training. We worked well together because we both understood that healing complex problems required acknowledging difficult truths while still choosing to help people move forward. On Thursday evenings, I still joined the community dinners, though now as a staff member rather than someone seeking help. The distinction felt less important than it once had, because I'd learned that everyone in that room was simultaneously giving and receiving support, teaching and learning, healing and being healed. The woman who'd once sat in the corner, picking at mashed potatoes and wondering how she'd ended up there, had found her answer. Not in the dramatic revelation of hidden identity, but in the quiet daily choice to use her skills in service of people who needed them. Sometimes the most important transformations happened not through single moments of recognition, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions to keep showing up, keep helping, keep believing that broken things could be repaired, and that people carrying guilt could still do meaningful work. Commander Johnson was gone, but Jordan Lewis had found her place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.